it's so nice to see some familiar faces in the audience. You know, I'm just going to start with a little bit of other backstory that Peter may not have shared. So one of the reasons we're together is because there was a call for proposals that came out early in the summer that was to think about what kind of document can we figure out to recommend to some of our colleagues in the justice system around doing assessments and assessing risk in the context of domestic violence and child maltreatment. We crazily said, okay, we'll do this, and now I've been trying to kind of pull together what we can to understand these factors. And so for me, part of what today is about and part of what this discussion is about is that we have some information to bring to you, and I would like to invite you to bring some information to us so that we can use the shared knowledge in this room to make sure that we can give the best recommendations and pull together the best document that we possibly can to inform continued practice in this area. So what my job is really to, turn my PowerPoint on. What my job is really to set the stage for some of these discussions by thinking about identifying the risk factors that should inform assessment practice at the intersection of domestic violence and child maltreatment. So it's okay, I was going to get there. So that's what my job is. I'm going to try to set the stage for this. And Deborah Sinclair, who was actually originally going to present later this afternoon, I pulled her into this session to present with me because she also has a long time experience of doing this work. And so I'm going to talk a little bit from a more academic perspective, and then she's going to talk a bit from a practice perspective on this. So one more caveat, and that is that, you know, as we started to think about what do we need to understand in risk when we're looking at the combination of domestic violence and child maltreatment, for me, one of the things that seemed clear is that we need to draw on knowledge from two really different fields and traditions, from the domestic violence field and from the child protection field. And we know that those histories and traditions are different, sometimes the values are different, and that there's been, over time, various levels of collaboration between those areas. But what I'm wanting to open to you as I start is that I hope that I am going to reflect both of those fields, and I hope that whichever one you're coming from, you find it a bit challenging and hear something a bit challenging to you. So just in terms of starting points, very quickly, we all are starting from an understanding that child exposure to domestic violence is related to harm to children. We're all starting from the point of understanding that the effects vary. Younger children are more affected than older children in terms of the age of onset. Longer is worse. Events that are severe and have traumatic impacts are worse. And polyvictimization, the number of contexts and relationships in which children are victimized, makes the impact of any one event in one context worse. We also are starting with the point that a knowledge that separation and divorce might mitigate harm. It may lead to increased security to children, reduced exposure, the opportunity to begin to heal. Or it might aggravate harm, increased risk for abuse, extended period of conflict, understanding that separation can actually be a risk factor for kids. And the other starting point I want to talk about is around the intertwining of domestic violence and child maltreatment. So we know they're highly interrelated. First, from the domestic violence field, we really know that there's a huge overlap in men's, and we're now going to start focusing on men and on men's perpetration of violence, on men's perpetration of domestic violence and men's perpetration of physical abuse. We know that child physical abuse by men and domestic violence by men are interrelated. Simon Lapierre is here, and he's done some excellent work on how domestic violence can negatively impact on mothering. If we take now from the child protection field, what do we know about domestic violence? Well, one of the things we know is that domestic violence victimization is one of the top risk factors for mothers' maltreatment of kids. So moms who are victims of domestic violence are more likely to physically abuse their kids, emotionally abuse their kids, and neglect their children. And we know that when we look at child protection files, if there is indication of domestic violence in that child protection file, we know that that file is more likely to be a long-lasting file within Child Protection Service, that the risk to severe and harm to child is greater, the risk for child removal from the home is greater. So what about dads then? Let's move on, because what we're really trying to focus on here is risk in context of separation, domestic violence, and we're looking at really men's perpetration of violence against kids, and how do we understand that? Well, there have been a few studies of father-perpetrated lethal child abuse. And in those studies, and I've referenced them here, domestic violence appears as a consistent risk indicator. So the most common, or one of the most common risk indicators in those cases is that men have been violent towards the children's mother. We also know from our Canadian Death Review Committee and Canadian study of child homicide that when we look at child homicides, and I believe this is going to be talked about a little bit more later, but when we look at child homicides in the context of adult domestic violence and try to figure out, are there differences in domestic violence homicide cases where children were there and were victims themselves, and when children were not victims themselves, there's no difference in the risk factors. And as I said, that's something that we'll be discussing a little bit later. So that, plus all the information on the overlap, leads us to what we took as our starting point, which was a reasonable starting point for assessing risk to children in the context of domestic violence and separation is to assess men's level of risk to mothers of repeat domestic violence. So if mothers are at risk, children are at risk. Is everybody with me? Perfect. Now, I know that the whole field isn't with me. This message just has to get out there, right? So good. Now I want to kind of go a little bit further, because for me, I don't think we're there yet. I think with this, we're 2/3 of the way there, but we still have 1/3 of the way to go. And why do I think that? Well, I think that in part because, you know, if a mom's at high risk, the child's at high risk, okay. If a mom's at moderate or low risk, does that mean a child's at moderate or low risk? I don't think we can say that. I think that we have knowledge from the child protection field that says that, well, actually, that may not be the case. And I also want to point out that when I think of domestic violence and child homicide, I think of the retaliation killings of men going in and killing women and children. That is a rare form of father-child homicide. Most of the time, if you look at child homicide data, most of the time when men abuse or kill children, it's in the context of the father being pissed off at the child, disciplining them, and harming them to the extent that they're murdered, or where they're pissed off at them and they harm them directly. There are cases, for sure, where there's a retaliation killing, but there's also a whole bunch of cases that I don't think we've actually captured very well, where there is co-occurring domestic violence, but the incident itself is really a father-child incident, not a father-mother incident that involves the child. Does everyone get me? Okay. So my question then is, no, we can't have 9 minutes. My question then is, what do we need to understand about that? I think there's 4 things that we might want to understand. One is, I think that we need to start bringing in risk factors associated with men's history and pattern of violence towards kids. What do we know about his previous abuse or neglect of a child? I think we need to think about whether or not the incidents of domestic violence involve kids. I think it's reasonable to assume that if men have used or involved children in incidents of domestic violence in the past, that there's a correspondingly greater chance that they'll be at risk in the future. And I think we need to think more about incidents of domestic violence that are focused on mothering. There's been very little research on this, but you know, if the domestic violence focuses on mothers, there's a couple of reasons why there might be greater risk. For one, the mom might be more reluctant to get help because she's convinced that if she asks for help, the kids will get taken away. And because women's ability to intervene might be compromised. I think we need to start thinking about risk factors associated with child vulnerability. Like, we already get perpetrator access, but what about child age? In child protection practice, that's a core risk factor. whether or not the perpetrator has a non-biological relationship with the child. So in 20 years of US data, that's an 8-fold increase of stepkids over biological kids in terms of risk. What about the kids who present greater than average difficult challenge to parent? What about children access to intervention? I think we need to think about other parent risk factors, both of moms and of dads. In Caring Dads, I see a lot of dads who are co-parenting with moms who are themselves also having some challenges. Does that increase risk to kids? And I think that we need to think of contextual variables. Okay, one more tiny thing to open, and I'm going to turn it over to Deb, and that is, we understand in batterer intervention, we've come to understand that men's response to intervention, how they respond to police and to batterer intervention programs, to a probation officer, is an important risk factor. What do we do with how people respond to separation and divorce? I think we can't ignore our assumptions, our ideas of how that happens. So, Deb, it's your turn. What we should be concerned about from mine, when risk for domestic violence is high, when risk for child abuse is high, when there's greater intertwining of the two, when children are more vulnerable, and when context is more vulnerable. That's where I'd like to start our conversation.
Where do you switch here? Good morning, everyone. My role this morning is to just speak briefly about a screening tool that I've been working on, excuse me, at the request of people who are doing custody and access assessments in terms of how they understand the issues of domestic violence and what things should they be considering when they're doing their assessments. Some of them, we have some here in the room today, are very specialized from the London Family Court Clinic in doing this, but there are a number of assessors who have not had specialized training, and I think as allies, many in this room, it's good to know what they should be looking at. So in my view, it's absolutely critical that we get it right at the start. It is so difficult to undo a really poor assessment that's in front of family court. So what I'm suggesting is that it's critical that we take sufficient time at the beginning to really understand the case, to get an accurate assessment and an analysis. If the record is not straight early on, it can take years to undo the damage of an inaccurate assessment. It further damages the mother and the children, does not assist the abuser to take responsibility for his behavior, nor does it assist him to live up to his potential for change if he gets access to the children, if he doesn't get access to effective intervention. In terms of looking at the abuser, what are we looking at? We're looking at a history of DV in previous relationships. We're certainly looking at the frequency and severity of past violence, shows you what the abusive father is capable of. We're assessing for level of denial and minimization. Does he tend to blame his partner, ex-partner for everything? Does he see himself as the victim? Is he bitter, revengeful, depressed? Does he believe his life is over without her? These are all risk factors we need to understand to get into his head. Is he obsessed with her? What degree of sexual jealousy exists? Is he convinced that she's having an affair? And is he refusing to end the relationship? Now, these are cases that are before the family courts, when issues around access, supervised access, sole custody, all those things are being presented. Does he have additional existing stressors in his life? Past patterns with these stressors, issues with medications, drugs, alcohol, finances, history of employment issues. Okay. In terms of working with the survivor of abuse, what kind of evidence are we trying to have people gather so that they can be available to assessors and that assessors take these issues seriously? We want to gather our evidence very carefully, get a complete and full account of her experience with the abuser, particularly anything that may be used to discredit her at a later date. Get that up front and make that a proactive response. Assess for the impact of cumulative trauma. Document all of the historical abuse. Assess her level of fear. I like to use the Webb scale. I don't know how many of you know this, the Women's Experience of Battering Scale. Just look it up, Google it, you'll find it. It's an excellent article. It's the only one I know that assesses the level of fear women feel. It's from that covert, invisible type of violence. You know that look that he gives her that's hard to explain? I use that tool all the time. Assess the level of intimidation she experiences. How worn down is she in her journey from his tactics? And identify in detail what those tactics are that are used against her. Very behaviorally, what the words are, what the behaviors are, what the gestures are. Get the results of the risk assessment that's already been done by others. I use Dr. Campbell's danger assessment tool in collaboration with a client when I am doing an assessment. I share the results with her, looking at level of risk, strategies for safety, doing a safety assessment, a risk management plan, looking at imminent harm versus longer-term risks. Ooh, I know you can't read this. I can make this available to you on a 2-page handout, and perhaps we can do that as part of the Learning Center, or can we, or part of this? Great. This is really on a 2-page handout, so I'm happy to. But gathering the medical records, other documentations that may be helpful to her in her case, letters from advocates, counselor, priest, elder, family members, friends, neighbors, allies. If she's keeping a journal, having her document, date any of the abuse that was reported or not reported. So many people come in front of family court, so many women do not have any documentation from the criminal system at all. Interview independently witnesses who know about the pattern of mistreatment throughout the relationship. Have your client document ongoing experiences of abuse. I've talked about this. Dates, times, detail, written in ink. Blue ink, I've discovered, is the best. And have it dated and signed. Have witnesses also sign at the time. And this, like our officers who secure the crime scene, this is somewhat similar. Gather items that were damaged. Document the damage, take photographs wherever possible. Advise her to make a police report. I know some don't wish to, but it can help in a family court hearing. And then that is what we would want officers to assist us with. Threats, stalking, physical abuse, we want that documented with officers. Having the SOCO officer, scenes of crime officer, take the photos, date them, have the 911 tapes available. And if she's still living with the abuser going through this, have these stored in an alternative address. And my last piece is around children. How do we assess the impact of cumulative trauma and domestic violence on children? First of all, we want to find out what have the children actually been exposed to. And I mean a detailed understanding of that. Addressing what their level of fear and intimidation is. How much do they know? How much have they observed? Have they been directly, physically, or sexually harmed? What are the tactics that the abuser may use on the children? Again, articulating them, not just to say a yes or no, but really articulating in depth exactly what it is they've been exposed to. And have the children aligned with the abuser? Do they mistreat the mother? Are there younger siblings that are being bullied or bullying and are using the abuser's tactics that the younger children or older children may have learned? Have the children aligned with the mother? Do they believe her, support her in getting away? And do they want contact with their father, or do they feel fearful of contact with their dad? Those are all things that I think are important. And then the last piece, I just want us to expand. I will make this available for you, this diagram. It's a piece of work by Jabber and Gupta. It's an excellent, excellent piece of work on having us expand our risk assessment to look at other aspects of risk that are not just abuser-generated, but really look at life circumstance, immigration status, poverty, racism, immigration laws, all of those things that we know. And then this is a map that helps you write that out for her. Time. Thank you very much.